Welcome to Experts Talk, the new podcast by the Italian Chamber of Commerce in Vietnam, designed to dive deep into key topics shaping Vietnam's role in today's global affairs. In each episode, we'll hear from leading experts as they share insights, perspectives, and analysis on the challenges and opportunities facing businesses and professionals with interests in Vietnam. We're kicking off this new series with a special episode featuring Professor Carlo Fabrizzi, a scholar of international law and an expert in trade relations between Italy and Vietnam. Together, we'll explore the U.S. tariff policy and its potential impact on trade and investment in Vietnam, with a focus on a potential agreement between the United States and Vietnam, which has not yet been officially concluded or disclosed, based on currently available information. Stay tuned as we unpack complex global dynamics with those who know them best. Enjoy the episode.
Hello everyone. Well, today I want to talk about something that has been on everyone's radar lately. The tariffs imposed by the United States on mainland China, how Beijing has responded, and most important, what all of this actually means for European companies that are active in Vietnam or are looking at Vietnam as a destination. So let's start from the beginning. Before 2018, during the Obama years and even earlier, tariffs were actually pretty low, usually in the range of 3% to 5%. But then Mr. Trump came in 2018 and things changed dramatically. Tariffs shot up, in some cases reaching 25%. Under Biden, those tariffs pretty much stayed in place. But while Washington and Beijing were still clashing, something interesting started happening. A lot of Chinese firms began moving part of their investments to Vietnam. And we are not talking about small projects. Companies like Jinko Solar and Victory Giant Technology each launched projects worth more than $500 million US. Then came Mr. Trump's second term in 2025, and he pushed the rhetoric even further, threatening tariffs of over 150% on China. At that point, a lot of people in Europe, in Vietnam, and across the region were saying, well, that's it. Chinese investment into Vietnam is probably going to slow down or even stop. But you know what? That's not what happened. Quite the opposite, actually. In fact, especially in the past few months, I've seen more and more Chinese companies looking to put money into Vietnam or even acquiring existing Vietnamese businesses. Let me give you a couple of examples from my own experience. A printing machinery manufacturer from Qingdao just invested $10 million US in a plant in Haiphong province. And another company which manages several industrial parks back in China is planning to build a dedicated electroplating industrial zone in Vietnam with around $200 million US in long-term investment. Right now, they're even setting up an office in the former Zalam district of Hanoi. And it's not just the big guys. There's also been a wave of interest from smaller Chinese investors, people who want to get their products on platforms such as Lazada and Shopee. So the question is, why is this still happening despite Mr. Trump's renewed threats? Well, the first and most obvious reason is that Chinese companies are under a lot of pressure at home. They've got huge stockpiles of unsold goods, and the domestic market is extremely competitive. As people say in China, 中国市场太卷，企业不得不出海, which translates to the Chinese market is cutthroat, that companies have no choice but to go overseas. But that's not the only reason. Another factor, in fact, is Vietnam's recent relaxation on restrictions for Chinese investors. In fact, during COVID-19, Vietnam informally refused to recognize China's new e-passports because they showed the controversial 9-dash line. That meant, in practice, the Chinese nationals couldn't register companies or act as legal representatives in Hanoi, since notary offices wouldn't accept those passports. But recently, that informal ban has been lifted, and now Chinese investors are once again free to set up businesses in Hanoi and beyond. And there's one more very important reason. Moving money out of China is tough. There's also the fear that your bank account could be frozen if there's even a hint of a tax or anti-money laundering investigation. This became a huge issue during COVID, when international transfers were practically impossible. Many investors realized they needed to keep part of their assets abroad, but not too far from home, to reduce their risks. On top of that, today's strict ODI, the so-called Overseas Direct Investment Registration requirements, make sending money abroad really burdensome, especially for small and medium firms. So what do? Well, many of them route funds through Singapore or Hong Kong jurisdictions, through which are more flexible jurisdiction, and then reinvest into Vietnam across industries like manufacturing, real estate, and even e-commerce. So, all in all, despite the political noise and tariff threats, Vietnam keeps looking like a safe, convenient, and attractive option for Chinese investors. That said, what does all this mean for European companies that are already in Vietnam or are thinking of investing here next? Naturally, the first thing people notice are the downsides of Chinese investments. And yes, like everything, there are pros and cons. Let me start with what I see as the main cons. The first impact is that when Chinese companies come to Vietnam, they're often more motivated than European ones, and they're willing to pay higher wages. That pushes up labor costs across the board, which make it harder for European companies to operate here profitably. The second downside is that Chinese companies come from a super competitive market, so when they enter Vietnam, they play really hard on price. They often sell at very low prices to grab the market share, and that can upset the balance. For European companies, this creates a tough situation because it's hard to compete on price without hurting margins. As third, another thing to keep in mind, and this is more of a what if than a certainty, is that the more China invests in Vietnam, the more influence it's likely to have here. Now, Vietnam has this so-called bamboo policy, meaning it tries to stay flexible and keep good relations with everyone. But if China becomes the dominant investor, that balance could shift a bit. From a European perspective, the risk is that Vietnam might start to look and act a little more like China, maybe becoming stricter, maybe less open. Just to give an example, in Vietnam you can use YouTube and Google freely, while in China they're blocked. Well, I'm not saying that's going to happen here, but if Vietnam did move in that direction, it could change how Europeans see the country as a place to do business. So, we've talked about the downside of Chinese investment in Vietnam, at least from my perspective. You might not fully agree with me, and that's fine, but it's not all negative. There are definitely some positives too, and I think there are real benefits we can actually take from China's presence here. The first positive point is this: European companies shouldn't see China as a rival, but more as a model they can refer to. In fact, Chinese businesses have already shown what works in Vietnam because the country today looks a lot like China did 15 or 20 years ago. Take, for example, Bincang, the bubble tea and ice cream chain. They've done incredibly well here by localizing and using a franchise model. Or think, for example, about a Chinese friend of mine from Beijing. He was in real estate back home, then moved to Ho Chi Minh City in 2016, started flipping houses, and later did the same in Hanoi. The exact same strategies that work for him in China are also working here. So, if Europeans want to succeed in Vietnam, they should look at how the Chinese are doing it, because their experience is a reference point we can really learn from. The second positive point is about cooperation. Yes, Chinese companies often look bolder and stronger financially than European ones. But let's not forget, Europe has created incredible technologies and brings a very strong working mindset. That's something valuable for Chinese companies to learn from as well. So it's not just learning from them, we have also a lot to offer. In fact, Chinese companies are usually quite open to using European models to guide their own development. That means there's room for genuine win-win cooperation here in Vietnam. For example, think of an Italian engineering company. It may not have funds to launch a major project here alone, but it has the know-how and expertise. If it partners with a Chinese construction firm which has the capital and the infrastructure, together they can deliver something really profitable. That kind of partnership could be a big opportunity for both sides. Another area where Europeans and Chinese can actually benefit each other is around awareness of being in a foreign country. Sometimes, because Vietnam is so close to China, so Chinese companies treat it almost like it's just another province of China, a place with a different dialect but still familiar. The reality, though, is that Vietnam is a sovereign country with its own rules, its own culture, and very clear limits for foreign investors, whether you're from China, Europe, or the US. For example, in certain business sectors, you can't just open a company freely. There are restrictions and extra conditions you need to meet as a foreigner. This is something European companies are usually very mindful of, and that awareness can actually help Chinese partners navigate the system more smoothly. And finally, on the other hand, I think one more thing Europeans could learn from Chinese is flexibility. This links back to what I said earlier about investment rules in Vietnam. Sometimes the authorities set conditions that may look quite heavy, like requiring a minimum capital that's really high for small projects. For example, even for opening a little barbecue shop in Hanoi, you might need to put more than $50,000 on the table. Well, for a small entrepreneur, that's a huge amount just to park in a bank account. What I've noticed is that Chinese investors are often more flexible in dealing with this. They're more willing to trust local partners, especially at the beginning. So they might let Vietnamese partner run the business for 6 months or a year, and then once it's profitable, they step in with an acquisition and turn it into a proper foreign invested company. It's a kind of step-by-step approach. By contrast, European investors tend to be much less flexible. They want full control from day one, and I get that. It's a very European way of thinking. But in a market like Vietnam, sometimes you need to take on a bit more entrepreneurial risk. Put some trust in local partners and test whether your business model really works here before locking everything down. Well, I hope this episode was useful for you and gave you some insights for you to apply to your future plans or even your ongoing operations here in Vietnam. Thanks a lot for listening and hope you will enjoy next episode.